is Michèle from Jasami Bookworm Podcast with our most recent episode. So I am delighted to introduce Guari Raje from Silent Sounds. Welcome, Guari.
Thank you. Thanks, Michelle, for inviting me to this podcast. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, we always love to have different subjects that entertain our audience. So please tell us more about Silent Sounds.
So, I am a storyteller. I'm also trained as an anthropologist. Um, and I taught and studied anthropology and worked in the field for many years. Um, since I became a professional storyteller, would have been about 6, 7 years ago. Um, I began to call my practice Silent Sounds, which is informed by the idea that not only do I want to tell stories, but I also want to hear stories um, from people, from groups whose voices are not heard as much, and just a curiosity of what exists in those places where you encounter silence. So that's what Silent Sounds is.
Storytelling is so important to every culture, and it's come down through the ages, through various cultures from history, passed down from generation to generation. And the stories that we do tell, whether they're, verbal, as you tell a story, or if they're written in a novel or through poetry, however that story is expressed, is very important to different people. How is it when you're working with someone? How does the storytelling evolve?
Um, Great question. Yeah, I think a lot of the times, um, you will encounter people, and if you kind of, um, when I work with people, and if I kind of launch into the question of, oh, let's tell a story, or do you have a story to tell? The first response I generally, let's say 85 times out of 100, I will get a response which goes like, oh, of course I don't know a story, I'm too busy, I don't have time for stories. Um, or if I'm working on in a workshop where people are recounting incidents from their life, um, if one kind of positions it as, oh, tell us a story about your life, usually people just go like, I have no story, you know and yet, as you said, all the time stories are what kind of um, carry us through life. We are storytelling creatures, as it is said. So a lot of my practice is, um, one dimension of it is performance. So I perform and I tell stories on stage. But the other dimension is what I call community storytelling work, where the accent is not so much on creating performers out of people, but just creating a space where people can talk about a memory that's present for them in the moment, and can have the experience of being listened to. Because I think one of the most important things, and why people kind of revert to this position of, oh, I don't know a story, is because they find that there's no one to listen, as probably there's not been as much interest. And so that kind of turns into this idea of, oh, I don't know a story. But it's so storytelling is as much about creating cultures of listening as it is about, creating cultures of telling. Um, yeah.
Everyday life, we all have stories, when anything that happens to us. So sometimes, as you said earlier, people say, I don't have a story, I'm too busy, when they think of it as maybe a fairy tale and that kind of story. But events that happen throughout our day are stories to tell. As friends will tell you, I tell stories all the time and adventures. And I think that's important in what you create with working with people, and especially sometimes those people may be vulnerable to certain, to a certain extent. Um, which brings me to the next question. You work on a variety of different projects. And as I understand, you're working on a project with the Scottish Asian Women's ECTA group. ECTA.
Ekta group. Yes.
Thank you. I tried. A
You
group.
try very well.
Thank you. How did you first come in contact with them, and then and then we'll discuss the project.
Right. So I moved to Scotland from England, Birmingham, um, about 6 years ago. And when I first moved here, got my first job, freelance project, was with a community radio station. It's a South Asian community radio station in Glasgow called Awaz. And they were running a project at that time which was collecting life stories of the older generation of Indian and Pakistani migrants, in other words, South Asian migrants who came to Glasgow very early on, in the 40s and 50s. And the idea was to document these stories before the people themselves passed away or transitioned, however you use the term. Um, because there were some very specifically unique experiences of being a first generation migrant in Scotland at that time. So, as part of that, I met a few women who had done some amazing work and lived some really interesting lives in Glasgow, who were members of Ekta Group. And the reason they were members of Ekta Group was because they were widowed. And it is not a very prevalent, but it has been a cultural practice from the more traditional perspective of the place of widows. So women who've lost their husbands, it they become rather invisible over time within their families and communities, unless they are very strong personalities. But in general, widowhood is a very, very isolating space to be in. And for the women who, had arrived in the 50s, 60s, early 70s to Glasgow from South Asia, very often the marriages were either arranged marriages, um, and they had traveled from South Asia. So they were not born and brought up here. They didn't have a support structure here. Their support structure was their marital family. Now, when you lose your husband in that kind of a situation, the the sense of emotional and sometimes physical and social isolation is exacerbated. So, in the sort of 90s, there was one such woman. Her name is Mrs. Adarsh Kullar, and she was quite a strong personality. Um, and when she became a widow, she was a working woman, a businesswoman, and she found it quite um, horrifying, the kind of isolation and invisibilization that she experienced. So she set up this group of women, and they meet once a week. Um, and initially it was just to counter the isolation, but over time they've been running now for must have been about 20-25 years. They've become quite a strong collective where they have talks from experts, they have yoga classes, they go on trips together. So it's a vibrant life for people who now find themselves in their 70s, 80s, elderly, children are doing their own things, there is no partner. Um, so it was through the project at Awaz, collecting life stories of men and women in the South Asian community, that I came across this group. Um, and yeah, had some really interesting experiences with them was very inspired by what the group did for itself. They're an unfunded group, so each of the women who is a member of the group contributes a certain amount every month so that they can have common lunches once a week. They, if you go on an ordinary day, you'll find them after lunch singing together, and a real pleasure in, singing their old songs, speaking the tongue that they, grew up with, so not just English. So it's a very, very vibrant group, and I was quite impressed with them.
I think what is also what you're saying is the commonality of the situation, that they are widows. So each will understand the other's position. And I think when a group comes together that shares such an important underlying trait, that is, a story in itself, and how they've come together. And although the tongue may be common, the backgrounds will all be quite different.
Yeah.
And so, how did you? Now, we're going to talk about the project that you're working on and how you came up with the idea. I think we can call it a biographical cookbook. How did you, how were you inspired by this?
I really like that term, biographical cookbook. Um, So the roots of this project really took shape when I was working on the Life Stories project with migrants. Um, and at that time, I found that, especially in this group, uh, there were women who were very, very kind of, they absolutely receded in the background. They wanted no part in, talking about their lives. They didn't want to articulate. And some of them even expressed it as, oh, those are bygone memories. What's the point of bringing them up now? Uh, but I was curious to just know them as people. And for the ones who were talking to me, I had some wonderful conversations with one of the members in the group. Her name is Bridge Gandhi, Mrs. Bridge Gandhi, and she has had a remarkable life herself. She's an MBE. And I was talking to her about, why is it that women don't talk, and, what could be done. And I remember her saying, you need to talk to them in a language that they are comfortable with. Now, I was really surprised because I speak Urdu, Hindi, so, I thought I had a common tongue. But what she was talking about was, what is the language of their life? In other words, cooking. And it was Mrs. Bridge Gandhi who suggested to me that, why not, have a cookbook of the women migrants. And we didn't talk much about it, but she had expressed, and that idea put a seed in my head that, well, if I did get funding, and it took me 2 years to get funding to document the recipes, um, I thought, yeah, I'd like to do it with this group of widows, because the situation of cuisine, South Asian cuisine, is very different now from what it must have been in the 50s and 60s, when there wouldn't have been many Asian shops. Asian ingredients were not available, halal meat was not available. Um, so the so yeah, a project grew from that I just didn't want to document South Asian recipes, because there's a lot of cookbooks about that. But what I wanted to document was the ways in which they created the taste of home cooking in the 50s and 60s, when ingredients for cooking South Asian food were scarce or not available. What did they substitute? So, how do you have, like, a dal when you don't have some of the basic ingredients? What else would you use from Scotland? And how did you find out about Scottish ingredients? So, part of the book then is not just about the recipes that were signature styles of each of these women, because in each of the homes they would have cooked differently. although they're cooking the same dal, but the recipes each woman would have found would have depended on her economic condition, how far she was from the shops, whether her neighbors were helpful, did she have a community or not. So all of that. So slight variations, say in dal or in, making a curry. Um, and um, the idea was also I wanted to know the story behind it. How did they arrive at that particular recipe? So that's what this book has grown to be as a biographical cookbook, that it has the recipes, but it also has the story of each recipe and the story of the woman who has, created this recipe. Um, some of them are not very some of them are kind of one or two line stories of the women because they were hesitant to talk about themselves. But you can see the story of her life when she talks about how she came by the recipe. And so I think that was what Mrs. Gandhi was talking about, is you have to find their language. And all of them have experience of cooking. That's something they can talk about. But when they talk about cooking, you're getting to know facets of their life, um, and what's important to them. Yeah.
And spices would definitely not have been available in the 40s, 50s, and even into the 60s, because I remember coming home to visit and how different it was. You know, Scotland's known for meat and veg, not well, actually meat and potatoes, and
Yeah.
sometimes you get a wee veg in there if you're really, really lucky. I think part of it was they had gone through so much with the rationing until 1954. I think that sincerely affected the culinary talents of, they were used to the very basics because nothing else was available. And I think that will also be a wonderful part of the story, is how did they, you know change, adapt those recipes to make it flavorsome and to bring home to it. And I think we always have the favorite meal or something that if we see it again, it takes us straight back to a childhood memory or a teenage memory, and that celebratory. And it doesn't even have to be a fancy meal. I remember the Sunday night dinners my mom used to make, and it was very simple with chicken and potatoes and such. But when I have that and salad, it just brings it all back, that feeling of warmth and family. So I think that's absolutely phenomenal.
I
So
think the I'd just like to mention that one of the most interesting parts of collecting these recipes has been, um, yes, the kind of post-war situation that the UK found itself in, but also that the ecology of, west of Scotland affected. Um, Root vegetables and potatoes were the standard, and what you get very often in these recipes is, oh, a packet of frozen peas, because that was what was available. But what the women came with, their home recipes were, fresh spinach, um, rotis made from corn flour, makke ki roti, sarson ka saag, those kind of things. So leafy green vegetables. Now, if they're not available in the form that they were available in India and Pakistan, um, how do you recreate those tastes? Halal meat is a big one, because yes, of course you have meat available here, but if what you need and what you can cook culturally is only halal meat, what are you going to do? Fish recipes. There's so many fish recipes. Now, it's amazing because these women are coming from places which are landlocked. You have freshwater fish, but not seawater fish, whereas here you find seawater fish. So, how are they creating recipes which, give them a taste of the kebabs and the tikkas from back home? They're not cooking fish and chips, but they're using saltwater fish. It's really, really been fun. And also, the other one I found is, as they described how they came up on their recipes, I began to figure out the whole configuration of where were shops located. And some of these shops, if they if importing ingredients from South Asia was difficult, I didn't know this, but people had the first kind of wholesalers had started creating uh, gardens, growing vegetables in their back gardens. I had no idea about, there was this secondary kind of agricultural practice that was developing. But yeah, they were starting to grow, spinach and ingredients that were needed in Asian cooking. So it's been a really interesting kind of process documenting all of this.
This project is quite different in that we're going to be producing it, publishing it. We'll talk about that in a moment. Now, it doesn't have an author. The group is the author, correct?
Yes.
So, what is unique about this particular project, Guari?
So, this project was conceived of not just as um, documenting the stories and the recipes of the women who took part in the project. That was the first phase. The second phase was publishing a cookbook, biographical cookbook, as you've so wonderfully put it.
Oh, thank you.
Um, uh, Publishing this where the women are not just actors in the project, they are the authors. And the logic is that, they are the innovators of these recipes, Scottish Asian recipes, of fusion food. Um, so my job is just as a compiler. Uh, in a sense, although I'm giving words to what they're doing, uh, they are the ones who have authored these recipes. And because each person from the group has contributed two or three recipes, um, 20 women have contributed two or three recipes. Um, they are all collectively authors. And I am so thankful to Jasami for being innovative enough to, incorporate that particular sense. Because I'm sure as a publisher, it's much easier to have just one author and just go with that. Um, but as we both know, and we both have been through it, um, working on a contract that gives authorship to each woman who's contributed has been, for me, a real learning process. And I think it's very empowering for the women to, see that what they've done in their lives is not just taken and turned into yet another commodity on the shelves, which, they get free copies of and give to their families, but they have a say in what is put out, how it is put out, and they reap rewards from, what came through their very difficult lives. So, yeah, it's been amazing to work with Jasami on this.
Thank you, Gary. And I think what's most important is the basis of our company was to give a voice to those who would not normally have a voice.
Mm.
And when we have projects, we work quite a niche. We do traditional publishing and have various divisions, but the ones that I really feel I'm proud of all of our projects, but the ones that give back to the community is what's key. And this is quite a different project. So, to get to the essence of it, we are going to be working on raising funds for publishing this phenomenal project through Crowdbound, which is part of Arcbound. And it's going to be going live on Monday, the 18th of September, which is we're very, very excited about. We're just going to be
Absolutely.
giving
Yay.
all of the information, and this is our first kind of because this is coming out on Friday, so this is going to be the introduction, so people will be able to contribute and be a part of this project and have their name on this, as yes, we are contributing to the production of the project.
And
Now,
I'd also just like to mention that this is a really, really important part of the project for those who are listening, because most funding agencies will give you money to run the project and document, outcomes, in this case, recipes, but they don't give you the money to publish. So crowdfunding is really vital for us to be able to realize this and put these recipes out in the public domain.
And it will be the traditional, it will go through traditional publishing. We are raising the money to absolutely make this a stellar project. It's also about raising awareness of the community. It's about raising awareness of funds that are necessary. And it's about, as you spoke of earlier, Gowrie, telling the stories, because once they have gone on, there is no one left to tell the story. And I have to admit that's the thing. My mama has gone off to heaven, and her storytelling is the one thing I miss most. I do.
Oh,
And I
oh,
think having that and the stories that we do tell are so important. I will have a link in the podcast description, obviously, so people will be able to participate and get the link straight to it. We're offering lots of goodies. Obviously, we just
yes.
don't ask for money, but it's a symbiotic relationship. We give back to those who give to us. And
Absolutely. And
so
we give back not just in terms of the recipes and the words, but we had a photographer on the project who was also documenting the women and the utensils and the ingredients. So some of those will translate into the rewards and the crowdfunding campaign as well.
absolutely. We have lots of ideas for what we're going to offer. So this will be our request to obviously not just contribute yourself, but spread the word around. And you'll be, we will be going through social media, through the radio, and continuing as we go on with this project. So as we wrap up, uh, who would you like to give a shout out to for just kind of today to say, it can be thank you or whatever, but who would you like to give a shout out to, Gowrie?
Yeah, so first of all, I'd like to give a shout out to the traditional arts and crafts tracks who provided the initial seed money for this project, and then University of Strathclyde, who also gave us the money for getting a super duper professional photographer on board, and Sonia Blichow, who is a wonderful photographer who has taken some amazing pictures of the food, the women, the recipes for this project, and the women of the Ekta group, because they've been really enthusiastic about this project. So, yeah, all of them.
Excellent. And I would like to give my shout out to Artbound and Crowdbound for giving us the opportunity to do a crowdfunding campaign. And without their marketing help and support, none of this would be available. So shout out to them and thank you very much. So as I say, cheerio. I never like goodbyes. This is Michèle from Jasami Bookworm Podcast, thanking you, Gowrie, for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you, Michèle.
And as always, I wish you a sunny day.